Is is there a cold breeze coming in through that door there? We can probably keep it shut as long as we can keep an eye, and if there's anybody trying to break in, we could let them in the building. That'd be great. Okay. Okay. Thanks for coming out tonight, everyone. My name's Tom Ledgley. I'm the coordinator for Horizon Ottawa. And yeah, so I'm just going to get started with like a quick presentation here, go over some of the more high level numbers in the budget. And then we will invite some of our panelists up here and get a little bit more detail. And then after we hear from all of our panelists, we're going to split up into some groups and talk about some of the different sections of the budget. Specifically, we want to try to be coming up with like some ideas for some tangible things that we can be asking for in our delegations, and like if you want to contact your counselor, that sort of thing, because there's only so much room to mess with the budget at this point, and we want to make sure we're being very effective with our messaging. Um, so yeah, the budget season, it's a particularly important time for municipal advocacy. But it can be a little bit difficult to do so because we only got the budget documents released on November 12th, so last Wednesday. That's also when council got their first look at these documents as well, even though, as far as we know, the mayor's office has been working on this stuff since like February. So we're really working with a short timeline here. The first of the committee meetings to where they will be tabling their individual budgets is tomorrow morning at 9:30, which is not a whole lot of time for us to look at all of this stuff. So I will be perfectly honest. I've had a really good like overview of the budget, but I have not had the ability or time. I don't think that would be possible to really dive into each line. So I'm hoping we can get some more of that context provided by our panelists here. So here's some of the big numbers that people have been talking about. We had some idea of some of this stuff with the mayor's budget directions announcement. So we are looking at, for public transit, there's going to be about a 10% increase overall in the transit budget. That's going to be paid for with an 8% levy increase and a 2.5% fare hike. So not a huge percentage, but our fares are already among the highest in the country. The one thing that I always use to describe that, and I've said this to several counselors at this point too, is that a $4 fare, if you have two people that you're traveling with, or if you're somebody who has been suffering from new ways to bus and you have to pay two fares to get to your full trip, $8 is not very far from the cost of an Uber. And I think a lot of people, when you're choosing between waiting in the cold for 30 minutes and then taking an indirect bus route or having somebody pull right up to you for a few extra bucks, they're going to pick that a lot of the time. So even though you might think with the 2.5% fare increase that the city's going to get more revenue from fares, I'm not so sure that that's really true, because that is going to affect ridership as well. Police is the other really big item. And we were told with the mayor's budget directions that we were looking at somewhere between a 5 and a 15% increase in police. 15% would have been like the largest increase we've seen in 15 years, completely unprecedented. But this is part of a trend that has happened over the last couple of budgets here, where rather than giving us a number like they normally have done in the past, like under Watson, the first couple of years under Sutcliffe, we're getting a range. And then when the budget actually gets released, so far, both times, all of those numbers have been on the more reasonable end of that range. And my personal theory is that they are trying to prime us to think, oh, well, that's not so bad. It could be worse. It could be 15. Yeah. So that's $26.1 million that is going to be the increase to the police budget. As a comparison, there is $23 million total for affordable housing in this year's budget. And so we're going to have the 8% levy increase for transit, the 5% levy increase for police. Other tax-supported programs are going to be getting a 2.9% increase, and that is 3.75 overall. That is a little bit higher than last year, but not particularly high. So this is from the city's budget magazine document, which is a bit more simplified version of the budget. It obviously leaves a lot of information out, but it's a much easier to understand for most people than diving into the complicated spreadsheets. So this shows, I'm actually not quite sure why they've put 2% under citywide when they listed as 2.9%. They don't have a description for that in there. But when people hear that there's going to be a property tax increase, they often think about that total bill and they think that's really, really high. I can't imagine that being even higher. But when we look at the actual amount that like an urban home with the average value is going to be paying additionally, that's $14 a month. So we're really not asking people to break the bank with this kind of an increase. And it's actually about the same rate of inflation. So we're really not seeing an actual real increase in the amount of money that people are putting towards taxes. Here is just a small comparison. We don't quite know yet what Toronto's tax increase is going to be because they do their budget in January. But in 2024 and 2025, Toronto had significantly higher increases to the budget. This is something that our mayor has been bragging about. He has mentioned that we have been able to keep taxes low while other municipalities are all increasing them. And to some people, that may seem like he's doing a particularly good job. But I am asking the question, why are all of those municipalities raising taxes? And maybe do they, have reason to be doing that? There's obviously differences between our two cities, but they're operating under many of the same economic conditions that we are. And yet they are not opting to keep their taxes in this artificially low range. And yeah, it's not even really accurate to describe what we're seeing this year or in recent years as tax increases at all, since you can barely tell the difference between the inflation line in Ottawa and the property tax line. We are just keeping pace with that, the same general amount every year. So here, this is another screenshot from the city's budget magazine. So this is how the city has presented the operating budget by department. I'm actually very glad that the city has made this resource this year. It is a lot easier to understand, and like especially this kind of information. I think this is exactly what people are typically asking for when they see like a breakdown of the budget, although it's maybe not incredibly granular and not telling us like all of the information. So if you're not aware, there's two types of budgets that we're working with: operating and capital. Operating budgets, that's can be understood as like expenses of running city programs and just the day-to-day expenses of things. Whereas the capital budget is new assets that the city's purchasing, like library, a police station, or a new LRT. So here's a little bit better of a visualization of that same data from the last slide, just in a pie chart here. So you can see some of the larger areas include public transit, community services, police, and water, sewage, waste, another big one. But I definitely got the sense that community services budget was really not explained well enough. That's not very clear what that means. So this is a breakdown of that budget by program. So, we can see that while I think a lot of people would be looking at the community services budget and thinking, oh, this is all for like social services, like helping the homeless and helping with addiction and that sort of stuff. That is a portion of it, but it's not everything. And it's also a little bit misleading to be looking at something like this and to think, oh, the city is spending all of this money on these kinds of services. Because in reality, the funding sources are very, very skewed towards other levels of government. Out of the $1.2 billion that's going towards the community services budget, the federal and provincial governments are contributing $890 million of that, and the city is responsible for $283 million. So $1.2 billion, we are not collecting $1.2 billion of taxes from Ottawa residents and spending that on these kinds of services. It's largely coming from these other programs. And those sorts of programs are stuff like Ontario Works is a really big one. And daycare subsidies as well is another huge thing. I believe that's around like $500 million. And that money is basically just going through the city because it is facilitated by the municipality. But to me, that's only partially like a municipal program. It's kind of still like a federal or a provincial thing. I recognize this is a lot of pie charts, but I'm going to pull up another one. This is the revenue for the operating budget here. So, as expected, property taxes is a very large section of that, but we also get a lot of money from other levels of government in the form of grants. Fees is stuff like transit fares, recreation fees, that all goes into that. And PILTs, or property in lieu of taxes, that's the money we get from the federal government for their buildings, just because governments can't charge each other tax. So it's just a tax with a different name, basically. Um, so yeah, here is the capital programs breakdown that's in the budget there. And once again, I have a bit easier to visualize version of that. So yes, this is purchasing new assets for the city. So this section on the right, this roads, this is integrated roads, water, and wastewater. So this is stuff like you rip up an intersection because you're replacing the road, but at the same time, you do work on the water and sewage and all that, right? The transportation services, that's things like road widening projects, but also like active transportation. So like new cycling infrastructure, upgrades for like pedestrian safety on intersections, all of that kind of stuff. So that's a little bit more detail than I'm able to provide in this like overview thing, but we might be able to get some more of that later on. Other really big box for other. If I had a few more days to prepare for this presentation, we may have also included a breakdown of what that other is, because, you know, yeah. So, like I said, that budget magazine, very nice to have, but also does leave a lot of details out. Oh, I have not seen the budget line item for how much making the budget costs. So this is my last pie chart, I promise. This would be the funding sources for all of the capital projects. So this is not something that is largely paid for through these property tax increases. This is where the concept of development charges comes in. So if you're not aware, development charges is like a fee that is placed on new home builds, and the money goes towards infrastructure that supports that development. So things like roadways and water and sewage and all of that kind of stuff to service the neighborhood where the growth is happening. Typically, it can be moved around as well. So that is my overall look at some of the big numbers here. I would imagine that there is still, this doesn't answer all of the questions that folks have. So I would like to invite up our panelists, and I'm going to ask a few questions of each of them, and hopefully we can provide a little bit more of that detail for everybody. So if you could all come up here and find a seat. All right, here we go. So first up, we're going to hear from Angela Keller-Herzog of Cafes. So my first question is a very broad one. What do you think about the environment and climate change budget overall? Just some broad thoughts.
Just a little question. So, honestly, I've tried to dig down, and it's hard to tell. Um, so you can go into the forestry budget, and you would find that they've kept about the same number of people, and they've increased their operating and also their material budget above inflation. So there seems to be a good trend. So maybe we're going to see more trees planted. And also, there was some money set aside for acquisition. So this would be land conservation for particularly sensitive land. So on the nature side, I think there's a sort of gentle upward trend, unlike with like the federal government that decided to like axe the 2 billion tree planting program, which was kind of bizarre, right? Like, why would you want to do that when everybody loves trees and we're in a climate crisis? Very incomprehensible. So the city isn't doing that. And then if you're trying to dig around for climate, it's difficult. So there is a $9 billion, 9 million in the capital budget, which is for implementation of the resilient Ottawa strategy, as well as for the climate change master plan, which is where the main mitigation actions are. But it's not broken down. So, and they've been feeding us this story after the audit about how they're going to spend on more impactful things. Well, unpack that, please, right? So, and then they have this lens which is great, like a climate lens tool, where if there's new capital projects coming up, they ask the project manager, so do you have any climate mitigating aspects in your project, or is it just business as usual? So based on that, they're saying, okay, so there's another um, close to 100 million that we think is like climate aware, climate enhancing. And climate is a cross-cutting kind of an issue, right? It comes up in infrastructure, it comes up in transportation. So we're keeping an eye on that the city is continuing to procure electric buses because the diesel fleet really does pollute a lot and affects our urban air quality. I think that the real solution is that there should be a long range financial plan where you're looking at the climate master plan, you're looking at the targets, and then you're saying, okay, to meet the target, to get there, these are the investments that we need. And the city is like nowhere near that. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. We are going to be after the panelists, we're going to be splitting into like discussion groups and stuff. So I think we may have time to have a few questions for our panelists once we've wrapped up here, but I just want to make sure we leave enough time. So Angela, my second question for you is, does it seem, based on what you've seen in this budget, like this will be contributing to the city meeting its own climate targets? And in general, like how are we at with meeting some of these climate targets that they've set for themselves?
So after years, cafes was kind of hounding the city in terms of getting our what is supposed to be an annual greenhouse gas emissions report, so that we, the residents, know how much are we emitting as a city. So, and that's broken down into the corporation of the city and the all the other parts of the community. So the corporation is about 4 to 5% of total emissions, and they're in the neighborhood of they could possibly meet their targets for 2030. For the community, they're like we're nowhere in the neighborhood. So and I mean, it is hard. Like, how does the city catalyze or incentivize or encourage all of us to have a more convenient lifestyle that is lower carbon footprint? So it's not a no-brainer how to do this, but you definitely need to invest. And I think those investments, we're not seeing them. No.
Another question that I was wondering about, this didn't come up from seeing anything in the budget, but a lot of the time when we talk about climate policy, and specifically when certain city councilors talk about climate policy, very often I hear them saying things about how this is a really, really big problem, and it is so much larger than the city, and we're talking about global impacts, so therefore the city can't have much of an impact. So I don't really necessarily think that is true, but would you say that, if the city is not living up to its climate targets, are the federal and provincial governments, are they doing enough from their end to be allowing the city to kind of slack a little bit and rely on their progress?
Let's look south for a moment, right? So it's pretty clear that Trump is like totally in the pockets of oil and gas sector, right? Who generously funded him in Mar-a-Lago. So it's not as bad as that, right? Um, in the United States, what we're seeing is that there are cities and there are states that are proactively saying we're going to step up, we're going to do our part. So I think the governor of California is right now at the COP30 conference, basically like unofficially representing the saner parts of the United States. So the Ford government in Ontario is also really dropping the ball. There's some recent legislation which like didn't really make the media that they're saying they want to like remove the requirement that Ontario needs to have a climate target and a climate plan. So, and they're going to just have outcomes. And I mean, I totally believe in outcomes, but like I also believe in combining outcomes with targets and plans, right? So Ontario is not doing it. I think all of the LNG investments that we're seeing in the federal budget are also going to lead to like more massive emissions. And it's pretty much admitted that Canada isn't going to meet its 2030 targets. So the federal government is not a disaster like the United States, but it's pretty bad also. So I think the time is here for the city of Ottawa to say, well, God damn it, we're going to step up. There is no more federal home energy retrofit subsidies. There are no electric vehicle subsidies. There are no encouragements for renters, right, to have more energy efficient appliances and so forth. So there's a lot that the city could do if we wanted to.
Before we move on, Angela, is there anything else that you noticed in the budget here that you think is important to mention or important for anybody? Anything else that is worth mentioning or knowing about?
This is kind of I mean, I said that climate is cross-cutting, right? So the main emissions come from buildings, they come from transportation, but they also come from sprawl, right? So as we build a more sprawling city, we need to have more like use of the car because transit doesn't go all the way out. And all that road building and all those like little houses that are not sort of benefiting from like neighboring walls, right? To make them more energy efficient. So and that is in some sense, depending on how you measure it, actually the biggest factor in terms of Ottawa's like future emissions is how sprawly we build the city. And the other thing, like I was at an open house yesterday for the E1 Wall Road urban expansion. Well, it's going to wipe out a whole bunch of wetlands, right? It's like, and then, you know, when you kind of say, well, what's with that? That doesn't make sense. And they're like, oh, well, they're not provincially significant, Angela. And it's like, well, I think they kind of still contribute to kind of the water budget in the local area. Didn't we just have a drought? So yeah, so I think that you don't need to be an environmentalist to like as you're pursuing your favorite discussion topic. It's pretty easy to make the linkages to climate and obviously also to justice.
All right, thank you so much. So next, we will hear from Nick from Free Transit Ottawa. And I know there's a lot of pressure on you here because I know transit is a very big item as well. So, and again, really broad question. What do you think of the transit budget overall?
Yeah, the transit budget's great. No, I'm kidding. It sucks, right? It's pretty much the same as every other year. And the reason that's a problem more and more is because public transit is one of our best levers to creating an affordable and low emission city. Transportation is like the second highest household expense because most people have no real choice but to buy and own and operate a car. And it's our leading source of local emissions. So if we really wanted to act on those fronts, if this budget was really about affordability, like it said it was, it would invest in a public transit option. So there's three highlights from the budget that I'm not happy with. So the first one is fares. Fares are going up, and it's increasingly unclear what exactly we're paying for. Transit is still horribly unreliable, inconsistent, infrequent, barely functional. So what are we getting out of this? And I think that argument applies not only to riders, but also to ratepayers. Somebody who lives in the suburbs and pays more and more for the transit levy, what exactly are they getting out of this? Transit is not usable to them. It is not adequate to replace their car. It should be, it could be, but it's not. Um, the second thing I flagged, so there is a commitment by the city to increasingly electrify our bus fleet, which is a good thing. And there's a line item to the effect of purchasing more of those electric buses. They've been delayed, so the ones we've been trying to get are delayed. But I think the fundamental issue with this is that we are replacing the existing fleet with electric buses. That's all fine and well, but if we want a frequent transit system in all parts of the city, we need more buses. We don't just need to replace the increasingly decrepit fleet with new ones, but we need a lot more of them so that we can provide for all parts of the city. And the third thing, so we are in talks to upload the LRT to the province, and this will save us some money. What's strange is that in the budget, there's an item that says we're 47 million is going to be saved from that transfer. The mayor himself said that this is going to take a while to negotiate. So we don't have that money yet. So we're claiming we're saving something that we don't have yet. And this is a trick that Sutcliffe has pulled for the last two budgets. He said, yeah, I'm going to ask the federal government, putty please, to give us some money, and therefore I'm including that in the budget as money we already have. And the feds never gave it to us because there was no commitment that they would. And the transit chair is saying, well, that was then, that wasn't a real promise, but this is a real promise. Like, we got a pinky swear from Doug Ford. And it's like, nothing is in writing. What are you talking about? Why do you keep doing this? And so, yes, of course, ridership plummeted during COVID. We are still recovering from that, but it's not COVID's fault. The city has run the system into the ground. They are underfunding it by the day. They're making it more expensive to use, turning people toward Uber, as Tom said. And that seems to be their prerogative. I don't know if they actually want people to use the system. If we're looking at this objectively, I can't imagine that anyone who would want transit to work would set up a budget this way.
So my second question for you, and you kind of touched on some of this here, but the mayor has been framing this as a historic investment in transit, and I thought it was very funny to hear him bragging about how we're spending more on public transit than we ever have before. Budgets just go up every year. That's kind of how they work, right? If they're going to at least match inflation, technically you can say that's historic investment. But does this budget, there's a 10% increase overall, right? Does that feel like historic investment to you? Does that feel like there's enough room to potentially improve service in any way or address any of these issues you're talking about?
Yeah, so it is a large budget. It's $900 million for the operating budget. As you saw in the breakdown, it is quite a large line item. And so it's not as straightforward as transit's bad because they keep cutting and defunding it. Clearly, there is a large pool of money. But to say that we are investing more than we ever have in the transit system is incredibly misleading. We now are operating 3 train lines with another coming next year. Trains be expensive. That's just the nature of it. Buses are far cheaper. Trains are very expensive. It's not that trains are bad. They just cost a lot more to run. And so obviously, the more trains we build and operate, the higher the budget's going to be. But to suggest that we have a better transit network is horribly false, because a transit network requires buses. Buses are the majority of the system. They're the majority of what people use. Even if you're using the train, for the most part, you're going to be using a bus to connect to it. And a lot of people don't have access to the LRT. They need a local bus. So what's been happening with bus service? Are we making historic investments in that? No. This last year, we had new ways to bus. It was a reduction in service hours. It added transfers to a lot of routes, cut a lot of routes, and put bus stops further away from them, all to save money. And so if you are trying to get from A to B and you need to use a bus and then the train, you're going to use none of it. you're going to buy a car or use an Uber or stay home. Yeah, the bus situation is abysmal. We have 735 buses in the fleet, which is down from about 1,000. Um, and only 520 of those are on the road at any given time because the rest are in the shop because our fleet is so old that it's being repaired constantly. And we are trying to replace that with electric buses. But the question is, are we going to be replacing them at a rate that is even allowing the fleet to stay the same size? Or is it going to be shrinking? I think the latter is more likely. But also, we are needing to add buses. We need to be expanding the size of the fleet and the train network. Um, on the note of the monumental historic budget increase, I was looking through the line items of the operating budget today, and two of the biggest line items, $250 million each. Um, I don't know what these words mean. Maybe you will. $250 million to non-departmental. What is that? What is that exactly? 250 million to transfers, grants slash financial charges. Again, maybe they could have been a little more detailed. I sent a flurry of emails today to a bunch of people. I didn't get a reply. But Neil and I were chatting, and I think we both agree that at least part of those line items is the debt payments on the LRT. So the LRT costs a lot of money. We went into a lot of debt, and we have to service that debt. And that is going to be somewhere in the budget, even if they don't highlight it specifically. So again, a lot of money not necessarily going to service.
Yeah. Here, yeah, real quick. You got a question? Sure thing. Yes. So the question is, could we introduce any competition to our transit system? Like, would allowing private companies to compete at all with the transit system, would that be a possible solution?
So I think this is analogous to the healthcare debate. So obviously, our healthcare system has a lot of issues, a lot of underfunding, a lot of long wait times. So should we introduce competition like in the States? Well, they might have shorter wait times, but it's a lot more expensive, prohibitively expensive. So I think the cost burden would probably go up. And the thing with private companies is that they're going to run routes that are profitable, and that doesn't extend access to the people who need it. So a very similar situation to what we have now. I think what we need in terms of competition, we need a transit system that is actually competitive with the convenience of Uber and Lyft and the convenience of car ownership. We need to be aggressively competing with that model, and that is not something we're doing. The city is happy to have it as a last resort option. If you're poor enough, if you're desperate enough, you'll use the train, and if you're not, you'll buy a car, and that's totally fine. It's not. It's incredibly expensive. It's incredibly destructive to the environment.
Okay, thank you. And there's a thought swimming around in my head, just going back to your last response with this idea that this unknown budget line might be going towards servicing debt. I'm thinking of a different city project that's going to have a bunch of debt over the years that we're not going to be seeing in a specific budget line. Um, but yeah, so the final thing that I wanted to ask, you mentioned new ways to bus. Another, I believe that was approved in the 2024 budget, but might have been 2025. Another thing that was approved in the 2025 budget was eliminating like the youth pass and making them pay adult fares. Do you think that I noticed that there was a line in the budget that was $14 million in operating efficiencies. So do you think that that is possibly going to be another service cut like new ways to bus? Could that mean more passes being cut, or what might that 14 million in operating efficiencies be?
Yeah, so I think these budgets are backing the city. They're backing themselves into a corner, because they say, well, the only way we can justify doing more is if more people magically start riding and paying fares, and that's completely backwards. And just the approach is so strange because we're spending a lot of money, but it's not enough for it to actually be good. So it's the worst of both worlds. And to use an analogy, if I had 10 of you over for dinner and I went all out, I bought the most expensive ingredients, I hired 3 professional chefs, I bought all new cookware, and I brought you over and you got the meal. And I said, yeah, the only thing I didn't do was I didn't cook it properly. I didn't buy any spices or seasoning, and I left it out, and so it's cold. You would probably say, yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm going to eat this at all, actually. And I say, well, I've made historic investments in this dinner. What are you talking about? So we've gone like almost to the line of spending enough for it to be good and functional and adequate. And we haven't quite gone the distance. And there's a lot of so I think it's that they want a really what was the word they used for the LRT? What was the pitch? The LRT was going to be a world class LRT. But then when it came right down to it, they didn't want to spend money to make the whole thing work, and so they said, "Well, we'll cut buses and we'll cut frequency, and the thing isn't going to work half the time." And so you can't have it both ways. You can't have it be functional and cheap. Like you have to spend the right amount of money to get it over the line and make it functional so that everybody actually has a chance to use it. And then when people start using it, they will save thousands of dollars by not having to own a car, and you can probably tax them a little bit more. I mean, in my ideal world, the federal government and the provincial government would pay for all of this, but I think there's money we can reallocate. So yeah. Oh, I didn't answer your question. Uh, so if they continue to do things this way, yes, they are not going to find the ridership that they need, and then they are going to say, well, we have to cut again because nobody's using it, so we have to spend less, and we have to reduce bus routes, and we have to reduce fare discounts and increase fares. They're going to say it like they're stuck there, as though low ridership is just some independent variable, and it's not a direct consequence of how shitty the system is, which is by design. So yeah, I mean, don't let them get away with it. Don't let them make these excuses. Transit is something we deserve. It's a public good. We deserve public good so we can all thrive.
All right. Thank you, Nick. And yeah, what you're saying about this money savings, I have a couple of friends who just recently, my one friend had enough. He works in Canada at the tech park. Kathy Curry represents the tech park, by the way, if anyone didn't know. And he was taking the bus every day, got fed up with it, and now is paying like you said, thousands of dollars in these car expenses, and he's not making that much money yet. So I'm not super optimistic for how that's going to go for them, and I'm sure they would love to be able to save that. So next we are going to go to the police budget, which normally transit is the biggest item that everybody's focused on, but I think this year it's quite possible that the police budget has surpassed that. So we've got Jeffrey here from CPEP to answer a few questions. So like the previous two, my first question is going to be a little broad. What do you think of the police budget overall?
I think the police budget is pretty bleak. It's one of the biggest investments that the city's ever made in policing. So I think, 26.1 million increase is very disappointing. We don't see necessarily the service or force getting any better. There's a lot of money that's going into things that I don't really agree with. I think, I know we're going to increase anchor this year, let's say by $700,000. I think that's great. I think it should be even more than that. And I see that OPS is, putting more money into this alternative that they're going to now take on, which is, yeah, basically it's duplicative of what we already like. It's basically anchor, but not. It's going to be like police led with a mental health worker, and those schemes don't actually work. So I don't know why why they're even doing that. I think it's because they're getting money from the province, and probably Ford wants it to go more into policing-led mental health approaches versus community-led. So yeah, that's it's kind of one of the highlights. I'm just trying to remember what exactly the amount was. So yeah, 2.7 million. I mean, if we could have that in Anchor, I think that would be fantastic, right? And could potentially expand it even further beyond Centertown. And I know it's expanding into Kitchissippi ward, so that's good. But again, a lot of the money here, like, you know, the 26.1, it's going to staff salaries. So even speaking with the police board members, they're kind of stuck themselves because they're basically pushed out of negotiations with the union, right? So those salaries are just going higher and higher. And we have so many people off on sick leave. We have people that are, you know, yeah, on sick leave or taking, you know, overtime hours because there's nobody else that can come in. So we're not having an efficient use of our police resources. So what I've been calling for is a total line by line audit of the police budget. And I know that there has been talks of setting up a committee that's going to actually look at finding efficiencies. I wish that this would have happened though before this budget. So I don't think it's going to happen this time, but for the next one, I think we need to be pushing for an audit to see where money could be saved and then reallocating that to things that actually keep us safe, right? We can't just keep policing our way out of these crises, whether it's homelessness, drug use, and other forms of violence, gender-based violence, that type of thing.
So you mentioned salaries there, and you're mentioning some of these problems that the city's facing. So what are the actual reasons that we're seeing like such a huge increase? Like, you know, it was initially proposed possibly up to 15% increase in the budget. That's like massive. That's unheard of. So what is the big crisis? What is the, like, have we seen a 50% jump in crime rates over the last few years? What is the impetus for raising the budget this much, do you think?
Well, yeah, it's a bit complicated, but I think that there has been a push for more police presence, which I think is due to a lot of media hype and fear. So we have to remember with crime statistics is that they're easily manipulated. So everything that is being reported by the OPS is police reported, right? So it's not including victimization writ large. And we know most crime is not actually reported to the police, and those that are, most of it doesn't even lead to any sort of justice response. So, I mean, you look at the clearance rates, they're not great. I think it's 10%. So, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're cleared, like something comes of it. A lot of them go to the courts, they get stayed, they're dropped. There's not enough evidence. So, yeah, I think that there's a push from the public to have more of a police presence, but that's because they don't know that there is actually things that could keep us a lot safer. Like, I mean, every dollar you would invest in, like, let's say street outreach workers or putting nurses in hospital emergency rooms to help people in critical moments and getting them into like job training, education, that type of thing could actually save us $7. So every dollar invested, you get $7 back. So I think we're continuing to invest in policing. So people are saying, I'm scared. I understand the market is not, you know, there's been more and more issues down there, especially with knifings, stabbings, and stuff like that. So, but I think that comes with the other issues that are going on down there, right? The drug issues, the overdose crisis, homelessness crisis. Not to say that these people are inherently more criminal. It's just there's more problems happening, and community members, you know, calling for more police. And I don't think that's the solution. But until we invest in those other things, people are going to be continuing to call 911 looking for a response, right? So I think we're kind of, it's a catch-22. So we want less investment in policing, but we need to have similar, if not more, investments in social and community support.
Yeah, and you mentioned people in Byward Market calling 911. That was something that Mayor Sutcliffe mentioned specifically in his budget announcement. Was he was talking about how the Anchor program was very successful so far. He was very happy with it, and he mentioned that people had been telling him that they are particularly happy that they have a way of calling someone who is not a police officer. So it's, you know, there's definitely some contradictions there. So my next question is to do with protests. There have been a lot of protests in Ottawa recently. A lot of specifically pro-Palestine protests have been, very regular, happening a lot. And I have heard some people say that these are over-policed. I've also heard the police chief and other members of the OPS saying that it's a huge drain on their resources, and they need to hire more officers specifically because they're so occupied with protests. I did also see that there's this suggestion that the mounted police unit and bringing that in specifically for protests is a good idea. So, is that something that you think is a problem? Are we seeing crimes happening as a result of protests? Are we seeing behaviors where a police presence is needed? Is the police presence at protests measurably justified?
I don't think so. This has been, I think, a fallout from the convoy. So, that was COVID times. There was a lot of negativity that went around on that, and obviously a lot of racist nonsense that went on with that. But I think we have to look at it in context. And now those sort of norms and principles that happen during that terrible time here in Ottawa, where, the noise, the hate, everything, it was just awful, to where we are now. So I wouldn't say that, no, protests aren't inherently violent. We look at critiques of even things like Black Lives Matter. 90% of those protests there was no violence at all. And a lot of even the few where there was violence, it was actually often like police or other right-wing instigators coming and drumming up trouble. So we have to be really conscious of that. Do I think that, the ticketing, the bubble bylaws, all those things, I don't agree with those, because I do think we have a right to protest. And if you notice, a lot of these protests that go on, they come, they go, right? It's not like the convoy where they stayed for 2 weeks and harassed us and, made us prisoners in our own city. So yeah, I do think that obviously some police presence is maybe needed in some regards. Like if it's a big amount of people going down the road, it's like a safety issue. But otherwise, by and large, like a protest that's happening at the Human Rights Monument, most people aren't on the road. It'll go for an hour and then it's done, right? What I do see though is that actually the police tend to not show up to protests that aren't widely publicized. So I've noticed that, like, anytime, let's say we have a protest around police budgets or anything, they usually don't actually show up. So it's more of the mediatized one where the public is saying, we want action on this, right? So if it's something to do with, war or genocide, that type of thing, there's like a public push for more police presence, and that's where we see it. So.
Okay. And the last question that I had for you, you did mention the Byward Market, but I wanted to specifically know. So the police recently opened a new station in the Byward Market, a small neighborhood resource or operations center or something like that, a cop shop. And I did hear, I saw some media articles and some quotes from the police a few months ago, talking about how that's been a great success so far, but that the results were still early, that kind of stuff. Do you think that at this stage, any conclusions can be drawn from that cop shop being open? And if they've already opened that, and if not, if we can't draw conclusions at this stage, then is it appropriate to be trying other interventions, or should they try to see if what they've already tried first is having an impact?
Yeah, I think they've spent a lot of money on the core program. So I think, the neighborhood operations center, it's really just a conference table for people to meet and strategize, and police go there to take breaks or whatever, pick up their guns, that type of thing. So I don't think that is a solution at all. I do see that some of the funding that they have going to caseworkers and stuff to do the situation tables, that is potentially effective. So I do know of unhoused and marginalized people that have been brought before that table and they get triaged to the services they need. But I am also questioning that, because how much money is going to the OPS to coordinate that? And could that be better used by a community organization or nonprofit running that, and then maybe the police be one partner at that table. So I think that's the ideal of where it's going to go, hopefully. But I think we've spent a whole lot of money, and I haven't really seen what the results have been, right? There's been more police presence in some hot spots in the market. And that's where they claim that, you know, crime rates have dropped in those areas. Well, of course, if there's a police officer there, you know, if they're arresting or charging, that type of thing, okay, you see a slight drop. But I would argue that it then just pushes it somewhere else, right? So into Centertown or into other areas of the city. So it's like you suppressed it for a second, great, we see them drop, but it hasn't actually made it any safer. So this is where you see a lot of community members coming out to board meetings, not always saying things in the most eloquent way, but there is people actually going through some really nasty situations in the market and around the area with people being inappropriate towards young people, defecating on properties, that type of thing. So there is problems, right? I just don't think policing alone is going to address it. So hopefully, you know, we can get more of that money going to things like the John Howard or E-Fry to help people that are in crisis, or even try and get them back into, you know, a good lifestyle with a supportive community. So hopefully all of us can contribute to that, because I don't think government can do it alone. We have to all be agents of change.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm just going to hold off on questions here because I want to make sure we get through all our panelists, have enough time for discussion. But folks can definitely, you know, switch between discussion groups, ask questions, and do all that throughout that section as well. So, oops. Next, we'll hear from Meg from CAWI. So my first question for you. What do you think about this budget overall when it comes to community services and the kinds of supports that that CAWI advocates for?
Thanks, Tom. I think that there is definitely a theme on this panel this evening. I mean, I have to say, I am also disappointed with the budget. I'll echo what the other panelists have shared, and I think you did a nice segue into this topic. When we talk about the importance of community services and social supports in our city, and when Tom was showing the pie charts, it's a large part of the budget, and I think we all interact with community services in one way or another in our lives, whether it's childcare or elder care. Community supports. It's really big. It needs to be a big bucket of the budget. But where I take issue, I suppose, is that we are in a cost of living crisis. And it's real and it's serious. The Ottawa Food Bank released their hunger report just last week, and the rates are wild. There's 1 in 4 in our city who are hungry. That's 25%. And so when we see that, and when we hear those stats, it means that people can't afford to buy food, right? That it quite simply means that people can't afford to buy food. And similarly, when we look over at our housing, and we know that our housing wait list is at 15,000 now, when a year ago it was at 12,000. So we're saying, like, that's a 25% increase. So what does this mean for our city? And so the issue I have is when we look at the budget, we could have looked at last year's budget and we'd be like, oh, are we looking at the same budget? When we see the stats showing that the lived reality of Ottawa residents is not being reflected in what we're seeing in the numbers. When it was COVID, and public health was, of course, the top of everyone's mind, we saw an increase in our budget go to public health. And of course, there's other sources at play here, right? I will not say that that's just the city, but we saw that our budget to public health went up. I think it went up by almost 32% than it is what we see in the budget right now. And that was because we were in a public health crisis. Well, right now we're in a cost of living crisis, and we're not seeing those same kinds of increases when it comes to community services and social supports. And so why aren't we seeing those increases? Why is the budget not reflecting the lived reality of Ottawa residents? And so that's my biggest issue with the budget, Tom, is that we're not seeing what we need to be seeing in community services and social supports, and it's frankly failing our community.
Yeah. Very, very well said. And it, I hear you talking about the cost of living crisis and how this budget is not living up to that, and it's driving me crazy how the mayor's constantly talking about how this is about affordability, but that only taxes. That's the only thing he's referring to. It's seemingly the only lever of affordability, even though we know that's not the case. So you touched on some of these things, but do you have any specific examples of some of the social services in our city that have been underfunded consistently? And, I know that we're not working with a whole lot of wiggle room here at this stage, but do you see any potential for any of these underfunded services, that those problems to be solved within this period that we have to affect the budget?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a long period to affect this budget. But here we all are, right? Because we do care. I think housing is one area that needs to be pushed on. I mean, we all know the state of housing in Ottawa, whether you're a renter, whether you're an owner. Housing is a challenge for everyone, of course. And so when we see housing in the budget, I mean, we'd expect to see more going to housing, and especially within the housing and homelessness services sector. I was looking at the breakdown of staff, so the full-time equivalent positions, the FTE positions, and there wasn't an increase at all in staff in housing and homelessness sector. Yet we know that at our last point in time count, we had nearly 3,000 people who are unhoused. And that was the highest we'd ever seen in Ottawa. So again, I guess it's back to my same point. Why aren't we seeing the budget reflect lived reality? And it's a lived reality that we all know so well. So I think housing is one area. I think again, and I'll go back to transportation a little bit on this as well, because the affordability equation needs to include transportation, and we cannot look at it in isolation, of course. And so we're seeing fare increases. We're seeing increases for paratranspo. So rural paratranspo riders, their fare is going up to $11 per ride. So that means if you live in a rural part of Ottawa, like say Cumberland, and you need to get to the hospital for an appointment, you're paying $22 in public transportation fees. And we're talking about, that's not, it's not because you have other options. That's maybe your only option to get to that hospital appointment. And so that's an area we need to push on. What else do I have? I want to make sure I want to make all my points. I guess the last thing I want to say is that when we're seeing the police budget as we're seeing it, and we're seeing a prioritization on surveillance, criminalization, and we're seeing that outpace the increases in social services, we have a prioritization problem. And so I guess my biggest thing that I want to say is that when we're looking at the budget, where can we find those ways to reprioritize? Because we know if we're spending that much on police, it means that we're having to take away from where we could be spending in other areas. So how can we push for a reprioritization so that community supports are getting what they need to get, so that people can get the supports that they need to live in this city? Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. So we will now go to Neil with Better Ottawa in the little chair. I hope everybody can see him. You could stand up. Yeah. And this will be really easy. I don't have to reach over anybody to pass the mic. So Neil, how would you describe this budget as a whole? And not just that, I also want to know, is this austerity? Is it focusing on affordability, or is it something else?
Thanks very much, Tom. Any chance you could switch back to that slide where you showed the tax rates in Ottawa versus Toronto? because I think this is really the core of what this budget is all about. And the mayor went to great pains to say that this year, well, actually 20, yeah, if you look at the rate of increase in Ottawa versus Toronto, he'll say this. There's two reasons why Ottawa's performed so well. One is because we are finding all sorts of cost savings, and number two is because all this money we're getting from the federal and provincial governments. Now, the reality is that the reason Toronto has those very high, what look like very high tax increases, is because they said we have a infrastructure deficit of $26 billion, and we're going to have to address this. Now, the reason our tax rates look like that is because we have an infrastructure deficit of $10 billion, but we're not going to address it. We literally there was a provincial law that said we had to come up with a plan for how we're going to fill this $10 billion financing gap. We had to report this by last July. And as a city, we decided we're just not going to. And so that's the only reason that our tax rates are not in the same range as Toronto. So that's really very, very disappointing. Very disappointing that we're frankly just disobeying the provincial law. But the other point too is, as I say, the mayor says it's about all the cost savings we found and all the money we got from other levels of government. To that question of cost savings. So, look, I spent 20 years at the Department of Finance Canada doing budgeting, okay? And savings are a real thing. Like departments have to return those to the center, and then the center gets to redistribute them out. What happens with the city of Ottawa is they just come up with a list and sort of claim these as savings. And so without anything more than 2 or 3 words in some cases to quantify what those are. So we come back to that example of transit. They're saying this year that they've got savings in transit of $14 million, I think was the number, right? That we talked about. Well, you know what that is? I bet you that I'll bet what that is. That is, we are now charging 13 to 17-year-olds the adult fare to ride a bus, and we call that savings. Yeah. So it is. So these are not savings. These are just transferring the burden onto someone else, and to sort of claim them as savings is just disingenuous. But is this about austerity? Well, it actually is exactly what sort of Meg pointed to, that it's the same budget we had last year, just with a little increment for inflation, with a couple of variations to it. So there's a significant increase to the policing budget, and that's about it, right? That's kind of the major difference to the budget. So it is very unfortunate that we are not going through the exercise that Meg said about what are some of the areas where we have been spending for many years, probably don't need to anymore, but we just do out of momentum and out of out of habit, where we could potentially be channeling resources to higher priorities. And that's something that we just haven't done. And so that's really and coming back to your point, Jeffrey, about a line by line audit, that's really what we need to be doing with every single department within the city, and just identifying what is no longer necessary spending that we can reallocate. Unfortunately, that's just not the way budgeting works in this city, and I don't think it's something that's the city staff particularly want to advocate for. So I don't think we're going to see it anytime soon.
So here's a bit of a follow-up, and this is something that I have heard a lot of people criticize, but I don't really quite understand how it works or why it works this way. So the mayor sets in his budget directions, last couple of years, like I mentioned earlier, he set a range, but the tax rate seems to get set before anybody is actually looking at these departments and what things we need to pay for. Does that make any sense at all? Is that something that is common in other governments or organizations or any kind of budgeting? Do you usually start with that high-end number and then work your way backwards?
Look, great question. And it's exactly the intent of the question is spot on, that any other organization would say, what do we want to achieve? How much is it going to cost? And then go through some sort of process of trade-offs, right? Like, are we prepared to spend the money for that? who, how would we raise the resources if we wanted to? That's the normal way a budget works and should work. In our case, this is unfortunately been the practice we've had for, well over a decade now, where the mayor will come forward and say, I'm going to run on a certain tax number, and then that number drives everything, right? And inevitably, that number is very closely linked to inflation. And so if you say we're going to have a tax increase that is basically the rate of inflation, then you're already, like the budget is set right there. There's really very little scope for any expansion. So yeah, I mean, it's very frustrating the way that we do this, because as soon as budget directions comes out, there's very little scope for any significant changes in the budget.
Okay. And then the another question that I had, and this may be another a big one. I've been hearing over and over again at city meetings, and this is not just coming from Mayor Sutcliffe, but a few members of council as well. There's this idea that property taxes are regressive, and that property taxes hurt renters, and specifically there seems to be this idea that increasing property taxes specifically hurts renters and like those who are on this lower end of the income spectrum. When I think about it, I imagine that since property taxes are a function of the value of a home, those who live in bigger, more expensive homes pay higher property taxes. So what does this mean when they're saying that property taxes are passed on to renters and this is a regressive tax? Is this accurate? Is this misleading?
Well, I don't see that it's regressive the way that it's being described, but I think it is important. Now, this is one thing I do agree with the mayor on. That property taxes are ultimately paid by everybody. Of course, homeowners are the ones that see the tax bill come in and actually have to, sort of agonize over it on a monthly basis or however often they pay their tax. But the reality is that landlords will pass on those property taxes to their tenants. And so although a renter may not be aware that they're paying property taxes until you stop and sort of think about what's actually going into your bill, it is there. Now, the one caveat to that is that for renters, it doesn't always show up right away. It doesn't necessarily translate to increases in rent as quickly as property taxes will increase. So that's the situation. But the one last point about this, and the reason I think it's important that renters understand that they're sharing in the property tax bill is that the people that pay the people that pay property taxes and see themselves paying it are the ones that are highly motivated to go and vote, right? I mean, homeowners probably, I don't know the numbers, but homeowners, I'm sure, vote at a higher rate than do renters. And I think that if renters understood that they have as much of a stake in this as anyone, that we might get a bit of a different dynamic.
Okay, and then my last question for you would be, and we talked about this a little bit earlier too. What do you think about the mayor's framing of affordability as being, pretty much exclusively around tax rates? Is that really how it works out for most people?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question because property taxes are should be such a relatively small factor of affordability for most people. When you think about all of the ways that a city can help us with affordability, property taxes is really like a very minor point. And I'll give an example. So our daughter was home from university last summer and got this opportunity for a fantastic job. The only problem was that the job was out on Anderson Road. And so we thought, well, look, we want to support you in this, but how are you going to get there? And so we actually went and looked at the road, and it's this, it's a 2-lane road that's got no paved shoulders, and it's like 80 kilometers an hour. So you couldn't, even if you wanted. So first of all, transit doesn't go out there. I mean, you knew that already. But so transit doesn't go out there. But number two is that even if you wanted to walk or ride a bicycle. It just wasn't safe. Like there's no way we would let our daughter ride a bicycle on that street. And we're a biking family. So we had to buy, you know, for her to be able to take up this job opportunity, we had to buy a second car for the house. And so luckily, we managed to find a car for $4,000, which is quite a feat in this market. But still, I mean, this was thousands of dollars that we're having to pay because our city isn't investing in transit. It isn't investing in the active transportation infrastructure that in an ideal world would have allowed us to forego expenses like that. So if you look at, what the factors that the city controls that really affect affordability, transportation, as Nick pointed out, transportation is high on that list. Obviously, housing too. I mean, just the cost, the ability of the city to make housing more affordable is something that also would be very significant. Not to mention just making sure that we've got parks where we can go and get out for, if you want an afternoon out where you don't have to spend money, be able to go to a park, or heaven forbid, like a third space indoors, where you can just meet up with friends and not have to spend that $5 for a cup of coffee. So the city is unfortunately doing much less in these areas than I wish it would. And if it did, it would have a much greater impact on affordability than a tax rate. I mean, just the last point on that, Tom, as you say, as we saw with the slide earlier, I think it was $166 for a 3.75% tax increase. So like a 1% tax increase is, like $40 to $50 per household, which is really, when you think about what you could do with a 1% tax increase in terms of service delivery, it's really, that's $20 million worth of services that you could be delivering. That can have a real material impact in terms of improving affordability. Thanks.